Hey everyone, it is finally time I review Wizardry. If you follow this channel for a while, you know first-person dungeon crawlers are a thing here, and what better way than talking about the game that pretty much laid the foundations for many RPGs. Dragon Warrior, Final Fantasy, Digital Devil Story, heck, even some others like Halo and Doom. The only thing worth considering is that it would be unfair if I review this game as I usually do, so I wanna give it a review as if it were back then, and of course my honest opinion of today's feeling. Without further ado, let's begin. In terms of the story, there isn't much to say. The task is simple: recover an amulet that was stolen from Overlord Trevor, so we need to dive into this dungeon. Now, if you ask me, since the get-go this story sets itself for a funny comedy because from all the options Wizardry had, like going deep into the forest, a mountain, the most classic cliché inside of a castle or something like that, he was like, "F it, you see the well that is in the middle of the plaza? Yes, that seems like a good place to hide, and deep we go." Once inside, it could be said that the first area is but a test, as Overlord Trevor will give the blue ribbon only to those capable of reaching deeper floors. And aside from this little test, there isn't much left. A couple of notes here and there, some warnings as you're reaching the evil wizard, and one not so bad congratulations. Okay, the first thing to consider is that video games in the 80s were really different. The main idea to jump into a game was to pass some time, enjoy the journey and move on. Few, really few were the games that had deep narrative elements. Because if memory works well, it was until the 90s that they started to focus slightly more into a narrative. But let's be honest, it was until the PS1 era that the industry became into what we know nowadays. Perhaps aside from few games that are like 40 hours of cinematics and 9 of gameplay. I'm sure you know which titles I am talking about. Now, the main reason is because if you ever had the chance to use floppies, you know these things had limited space, and you also needed to make plenty of copies just in case. And sometimes they were like, "Today is my last day, master." With this in mind, back in the day I would give it an 8. It wasn't bad, but it is more than obvious that it didn't age that well. And with today's standards, I will give it a 5 or 6. I mean, considering that the main inspiration was D&D, where sometimes all you needed was some decent imagination, a couple of mugs, and you were good to go. Gameplay wise, all I gotta say is that most of you, and I know why first-person dungeon crawlers are infamous as heck, and this is where I ask, do you wanna know how to play a Wizardry game?
Day 3. One eternity later.
I know it is dumb, but it is also true. In any case, let's go by parts. This particular version has different difficulty settings. You can go for the original experience or get into a much friendlier one. But I don't know, I have some divided opinions regarding this statement about the complexity of the dungeons. While it says that the console ones were harder, I have to disagree to a certain extent, because floor 6 is almost the same thing. Floor 7, yeah, I agree, the console one is trickier as there is but one way to proceed, unless you decide to dive deeper and from there leave some mapping aside. And floor 8 in the original release was obnoxious as heck if you arrived using the stairs and for some reason you have to retreat. Well, other settings worth checking out is regarding the aging of your character, if there are chances to get negative points and things like that. Just set things however you feel much more comfortable. Once you're done with this, you can create 6 characters, and yep, I made them blindly and lived with my choices. With this, I still agree with plenty of people regarding the alignment thing about D&D. Neutral doesn't really help in the long run, so I recommend to make good or evil characters. That way you can spice some late options, because once you start reclassing, you will notice that some classes will be out of hand unless this alignment thing plus specific stats are fulfilled, or once you find a particular item down the line. And also consider that you won't get something really worth keeping until you're somewhere around floor 7, so having a thief isn't really worth it. and having a ninja doing thief work is not the best of options, because they have lower chances to bypass traps, so be careful. Aside from that, consider these evolutions as the combination between two classes. For example, the ninja is a fighter and a thief, a lord is a priest and a fighter, so what really helps is that you can give them heavier equipment, otherwise some units are but glass cannons. Whatever the case, if you wanna have a harder experience as this moron, you can set your characters as neutrals, leaving you plenty of samurais to play around. Once the party is arranged, it is time to get into this hellish adventure. Back in the day, the main idea was to create your maps by hand, but you can also use Duma Peek, which is a mage skill that lets you see the map and your position, plus the areas you have traversed within the dungeon. Just be careful, do not trust this lower map area, as it can start to overlap where you've been, and it can be confusing as heck. So always keep some Duma Peek uses. This is a short game that can be finished in something like 20 hours. Worst case scenario, if RNGesus is giving you a cold stare, things can get complicated. So always remember, leave some healing items and magics to lift ailments, otherwise you can end up with plenty of party members paralyzed, in front of bad encounters, level drains and whatnot. An expedition that started really well with decent loot may turn into a stressful return where most of your team is being carried in coffins all over the place while the party is barely holding together. For the most part, that is what is going to hold you back, because if you do not take the elevator to move around, sometimes you may enter into a floor, get a bad encounter, and you have to go back to recover your team. And also remember, do not get overconfident, as there are some, let's say, little bosses that may give you a bad time, particularly in floor 4, 7 and of course 10. Wizardry is a really basic RPG, where you have but few commands, as attack, parry, inspect, use items and run. If you select attack, your unit will go for some random melee move. It will land in whatever enemy. You do not have the chance to choose the target. Same principle goes for offensive magics. Just consider that they have different roles, so at first they don't do that much. However, down the line they are the ones that most likely will support your whole team. Inspect is but a bad joke, as you make a roll to check if you get some information out of the enemy. Just save yourself the issues, and use the priest magic to identify if you want to know the enemies. And run is also another wild bet, as sometimes you may use it over and over again, but it can miserably fail every single time. Aside from this, the hardest thing is fighting Werner, as he can spawn with plenty of mobs that can make your life a living hell, where once again, if RNGesus is against you, he can spam freaking tilt to wait and beat the heck out of your party in a couple of turns. I don't recommend to get into this fight with your first classes. Always reclass, at least once, and try to have over 100 HP. That is actually the whole thing about reclassing, otherwise mages and priests may end up with few hit points, and there is no real strategy here, so it goes a la vieja escuela. The one with the biggest club is the one that is going to leave victorious out of this mess. So yep, brute force your way. In my humble opinion, back in the day this was an interesting experience. Video games were so primitive, but also technology was new and fascinating, to a point where paint was entertaining to use. While this thing seems basic as heck, I would have given it an 8. These kinds of experiences didn't really change until several years later, even with other entries like Eye of the Beholder, and of course titles like the aforementioned Final Fantasy, Dragon Warrior. They were like playing a top-down view wizardry game. Nowadays, some of you know my opinion about these kinds of executions. Within the RPGs they are repetitive and boring, so I will give it a 5. There isn't much fun farming around and simply pressing one button. And yeah, I understand that some games want to bring a wizardry-like approach, but you really need to like this subgenre if you want to see things through, at least with some particular entries. Cutting the chase with the graphics, there were no issues of any kind, so moving to the aesthetics and other visual things. That is the best part of this game. I really like how it looks, every little detail it has. I know it may be seen as overpraising what was thrown here, but let's be honest. If you see that little window down there, that is how first-person dungeon crawlers were played back in the day. And it is but an effing torture wherever you wanna see it. And the deal is that it was really easy to get lost, turning the whole experience into a nightmare. But now with a game that loads floors really fast, detailed environments and some extra colors, this thing is way friendlier to the eye. Sure, there are other hyper-realistic games out there, and I emphasize it as I know there's plenty of players who look for them, but for your average DRPG, this game has beautiful looks. Now, just to clarify things, there are two parts in this dungeon, the upper floors and the lower floors, so there are but two executions. Do not expect something like Etra and Odyssey, filled with ominous and eye-catching dungeons. And while I can critique repainted enemies and stuff like that, it is also true that there were but few enemies, and considering that this game tries to be the closest to what it was, it would be over-moronic for myself to point it as a flaw. So yeah, back in the day I would have said it was a 7. While the gaming industry was primitive as heck, it didn't take long before other beautiful series start to appear. And for today's standards, considering your average DRPG and so on, it can live with a 10. The dungeon, enemy design, the attack effects and so on are well executed. And last but not least, its music. The particular OST of this game was composed by Winifred Phillips. She is well known because of some other works as God of War, Little Big Planet and Assassin's Creed 3. It is worth mentioning that she won the Grammy Awards for Best Soundtrack for a Video Game and other interactive media. Some of you know my opinion about that kind of awards, and what I say regarding the best game of the year and stuff like that. At least when it comes to these kinds of shows. Now, I don't say it like that as a form to diminish her experience. The fact is that this is a well-executed soundtrack that fits really well this setting, where things were solved with swords and magic spells. In a general and simplistic summary, to me, it is reminiscent to the medieval era, particularly what was composed by troubadours. But of course, each track has a different style. Diving into technical executions, some remind me to something like a dance, others the Renaissance, the 12th to 14th century, and some orchestral arrangements, where those air, string and percussion instruments do the trick, elevating notes in combats while keeping it tense and calm as you move around the dungeon. Let's be fair, we cannot really compare things here. Once we move all those years back, there was no soundtrack, and MIDIs tried to bring as much alive as possible, but there were too many limitations. If you ask me, I prefer the combat theme composed by Kentaro Haneda and Nobuyuki Onogi. That battle theme is legendary, and to be honest, I would have liked to listen to this particular composition here, of course, in all its glory. I've said it before, I am not the best of fans when it kinda sounds like a movie, and there is a point where that is the impression that gives me. Being picky, there was no original soundtrack, so 0 I guess, unless you let me pick the Famicom release, then an 8 or 9, and this particular release is an 8 for me, but that is more about particular taste in music. Wizardry final score is an 8, and nowadays a 7 at best. In all honesty, it is hard, really hard to recommend this game to everyone, because of its gameplay and feeling, at least nowadays. As a window to the past, yep, it does the trick perfectly well, but for those who didn't live those particular times and of course dislike the RPGs, it is like, nah, stay away from this. As for those who had a chance to play these kinds of games, yeah, I recommend it if you wanna have a harsh and grindy experience, otherwise just stay away from it. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.